This talk is sort of a polemic. I hope it will become clear that it's more a polemic in favor of something than a polemic against things, but there's a little bit of both. So, in the 1990s, widespread digitization sparked anxieties that we were entering an age of untrustworthy images. These were images that were mere simulations with no grounding in reality. The specter of manipulation loomed large over the grid of pixels that constitutes every digital picture, potentially weakening its testimonial value. Meanwhile, postmodernism's delight in pastiche, its waning of historicity, and its critique of concepts such as truth suggested a realignment of epistemological foundations. If all images are the product of conventions, of the play of codes, what then becomes the difference between nonfiction and fiction? As this argument went, reality, fiction, it makes no difference because everything is a construction, everything is governed by representational conventions. Jean Baudrillard famously, or perhaps infamously, proclaimed that we were experiencing a fading of the real. In a chapter called The Murder of the Real, not, to put it too bluntly, Baudrillard states his point in a very characteristically totalizing and declarative way. He says, in our virtual world, the question of the real, of the referent, of the subject and its object can no longer even be posed. So now we are over 20 years later, and I think this same notion that we're living through a time marked by a threat to the truthfulness of images and also to their grounding in reality remains with us, and perhaps today it feels even stronger than ever. This is something that I think we can see playing out in diverse ways. Much popular cinema has moved away from the primacy of lens-based capture, so it forgoes the documentary registration of real bodies in real spaces. There's absolutely nothing special about special effects anymore. Reality television is nothing of the sort. In the Trump era, when fake news proliferates and the US president regularly now deems real news fake, it's difficult not to feel like this postmodern critique of objectivity and neutrality has fully done its job, and perhaps even too well. These are notions I think now we can say lie in absolute ruin. In his recent year-end roundup for Sight and Sound, entitled The Best Documentaries of 2016, the filmmaker Robert Greene began with a flat-out declaration. Quote, in 2016, reality collapsed. Greene continues with a very evocative image. Quote, the rotted legs of the stilt house, under attack for so long, finally snapped like toothpicks, and our collective shelter of shared experience crashed into the ocean, end quote. And so in this first paragraph, he cites both the pervasive misinformation of the Brexit campaign and also the ongoing mess that is the US presidency as evidence. So facts, he says, are dead. We are living in a post-truth era. And yet, at the same time, beyond and indeed at times in opposition to such media spheres, documentary today is absolutely flourishing. We have artists and filmmakers who are pushing the field forward in ways that both extend and also contest its long history in light of contemporary conditions. So digitization has proved to be not just a threat to documentary, but also a boon. Beyond simply providing new tools for production, which of course it has done, digital technologies have also transformed our understanding of reality and also changed our relationship to the fabrication and circulation of images. And so these, I think, are significant issues that in some ways might accord documentary a new urgency. Can you hear me? Yeah? Down? Okay, thank you. Could accord documentary a new urgency as a means through which these questions might be addressed. So a question sort of emerges from this situation, and that is, how do we conceptualize the relationship between the undeniable vibrancy of contemporary documentary and this larger political or theoretical climate that I've just very briefly sketched? So there are many, many definitions of what constitutes documentary. I'm not particularly going to get into that. But I have always been very fond of a simple and I think very generous one from Bill Nichols. He says that in documentary film, we're offered access to the world rather than to a world, to a fictional world. So we can see here, I think, how this definition opens up the possibility of thinking about documentary as a kind of presence within ostensibly fiction films. Today, I'd like to think a little bit about what the kind of access to the world afforded by documentary practices looks like, and also what it might mean in our contemporary moment. And this is a moment, of course, marked by ubiquitous computing, by widespread political, humanitarian, and ecological crises, and by what some, like Green, have termed a collapse of reality. So one way of understanding the vitality of contemporary documentary is to periodize, and to say that the documentary impulse in, say, contemporary art is representative of a fatigue with postmodernism. So we could say that it's evidence that we have left that paradigm and moved into something else, into some kind of new cultural dominant. In The Return of the Real, the art historian Hal Foster diagnoses the fascination with trauma and objection in the art of the 1990s in this way. He says it's in part symptomatic of, quote, a dissatisfaction with the textualist model of culture as well as the conventionalist view of reality, as if the real, repressed in post-structuralist postmodernism, has returned as traumatic, end quote. So similarly, we might suggest that this surge in documentary practices today is another such return of the real after its long time bracketing. I would say that this idea of a move beyond postmodernism is a very persuasive way of accounting for the proliferation of documentary in contemporary art, and also the vibrancy of experimental documentary more broadly. But I would also say that it's by far the end of the story. Though it may feel as if the theoretical paradigm of postmodernism is now outmoded, and perhaps it is in some sense, I think it's actually in this moment that we find the development of certain propositions that remain very much with us, guiding the production of certain strains of contemporary documentary, as well as a larger critical discourse around them. So much contemporary documentary in an experimental or artistic context remains intimately marked by the idea that problematizing the relationship to the real is an inherently good and necessary thing, sometimes at the limit of suggesting that there is no functional distinction to be made between reality and fiction. Robert Greene, the author of the Sight and Sound piece that I mentioned, is a filmmaker, and his films Actress from 2014 and Kate Plays Christine from 2016 arguably take up this position. So these are documentary films in name, but in fact their project is in some sense to debunk the very possibility of documentary representation. So Green writes that we are living in an era of post-truth documentary. And this is his term for some of the creative contaminated work that occupies a prominent position today. So I think for a long time now, and very much as part of a still powerful influence of postmodernism, this idea of breaking down boundaries has been understood as an inherently progressive and critical activity within the sphere of contemporary art. So if you think of how many times you've seen this on press releases or wall texts, I mean, it's really staggering. So I think this muddling of the distinction between fact and fiction, between true and false, is an undeniable hallmark of the way that documentary has manifested itself in the 21st century, specifically within the sphere of art. And it tends to be understood as something that is good and desirable. It's something that's often taken as a marker of the work's interest, of its criticality, of its sophistication vis-a-vis questions of truth. This is, of course, a very diverse and pluralistic field, so I'm not trying to totalize it. But as Hito Sterl has noted, quote, "The only thing we can say about the documentary mode in our times is that we always already doubt if it is true," end quote. I think it's important to note that this doubt is not just a kind of inevitable spectatorial attitude, it's also something that we see inscribed textually within many documentary works. So artists and filmmakers go to great lengths in some cases to signal that the veracity or immediacy of what we are seeing should be questioned. So if Trump and Brexit seem to fuel a kind of perverse fulfillment of the Baudrillardian hypothesis, here I think we can see a persistence of another side of this postmodernist suspicion of reality. And this is the notion that there is an ongoing critical demand to dismantle documentary, so that what filmmakers and artists working in this mode should do is always put its central terms, reality, truth, under erasure through reflexive devices, even as they continue to stake a claim on actuality. So this is as if the main battle at stake were to fight a kind of naive belief in the truth of the image at all costs. So I know that this doesn't by any means encompass the range of documentary practices that exist. I'm pointing to sort of one particular strain and also a critical apparatus that goes along with it. But there is a sense that these are works, this strain I'm talking about, these are works that seem to say to us, not me, I'm not a dupe. I know better than to believe, and so should you. So I think there's a tremendous urgency today to think the relationship between the seeming unreality of the contemporary world, the collapse of reality, and the efficacy of these postmodernist strategies that seek to problematize documentary truth. These latter strategies were once deemed oppositional. They broke away from a conception of documentary as a kind of pseudoscientific aspiration to objectivity. When Trinh Minh Ha wrote in 1990 that there is no such thing as documentary, she wrote against an ingrained orthodoxy and called for an interrogation into the production of meaning. But many of the things that Trinh advocated for are now absolutely commonplace. There's a sense that they are the new orthodoxy. So I think we need to acknowledge in some way that the ground that we stand on has shifted. Are these moves, in all cases, still the vanguard techniques that they once were? Or have they now hardened into cliches? Critique is always relational. So I think that a sort of serious question has to be asked. In an age of so-called post-truth politics on both sides of the Atlantic, is it still necessary or compelling for filmmakers who depend on the frisson of the real to insist that we cannot believe in what we see? What is the critical efficacy of confusing reality and fiction today or asserting their functional equivalence? For some, the blurred line between between fiction and documentary is a very productive, generative means of getting at a truth that lies beyond the immediately given or the immediately visible. Many recent employments of docufiction, and there have surely been many, turn to fictionalizing techniques for very good reasons, in order to contest hegemonic narratives, to revive lost histories, or to open on to the affective realms of subjectivity, fantasy, and imagination. In other words, the best of many of these departures from documentary naturalism delight in contamination, but they do so in order to lead back to truth and not to eradicate its possibility. But there are also cases in which this questioning can lead us to a dangerous relativism that can annul a distinction between reality and fiction that we might rather want to fight for. So rather than assuming that there is something inherently good about blurring the boundary between fiction and nonfiction or disrupting the naturalism of recording, I think we need to ask, when does emphasizing the conventionality of the image undermine our ability to make truth claims, and when does it help us to do so? Do we need to be told, sometimes incessantly, that an image is mediated, that it's not to be trusted, lest we fall into some mystified abyss of mistaking a representation for unquestioned immediacy? Are we actually that iconophobic? Because that's ultimately, I think, what it is. Or can we be trusted to make these judgments for ourselves? So I'll be very, very clear. I'm not advocating some kind of return to objectivity. I don't really believe in objectivity in this context. But I do think perhaps it's time for us to change the evaluative criteria that we use to judge what counts as vanguard opposition. So I'm not condemning docufiction by any means, but I am suggesting that we need to be suspicious of these proclamations that we've lost access to reality, as well as to this idea that today reality and fiction have become indistinguishable. I'm suggesting that the act of looking closely at a representation of the world might today be a very important thing to do. I'm absolutely not ready to endorse an era of post-truth documentary any more than I am an era of post-truth politics. It's a kind of commonplace of some postmodernist criticism to say that documentary has no privileged relation to truth. But I wonder if this remains a tenable position today, or if it actually plays into the hands of dangerous, increasingly hegemonic formations. So the question is, what kinds of filmic practices do we see as the most vital responses to this state of affairs? And it's the observational documentary that to me seems important in this regard, because it puts the contingency of lens-based capture at its core, and it breaks away from these potentially hackneyed cliches of reflexivity and from the threat of postmodern cynicism. So take, for instance, J.P. Sniadecki and Libby Cohen's People's Park from 2012. This film is a 78-minute-long take, filmed from a wheelchair as it moves through a public park in Chengdu in Sichuan province in China. And so whereas the long takes of photochemical film would be limited to 1,000 feet of film or about 10 minutes, here the camera can keep rolling. And as the camera moves through the park, it captures this astounding array of daily activities that occur within it. It's absolutely clear that this is a very choreographed and planned scene. There's a high level of control to the camera's movements. There's the sense that the directors have really researched the routines of the park and have timed and planned their route accordingly. And yet the film absolutely privileges and facilitates the viewer's encounter with contingency. It's a film, I think, that asks us to be attuned to the world. There's no voiceover telling us how to apprehend the image. There's no clever reflexive devices that are meant to make us aware of multiple layers of mediation. Rather, there's a reassertion here of the primacy of the film object. So the filmmakers, in other words, exploit the non-human automatism of capture. People's Park is just one example, but I think we can see this kind of reemergence of the observational mode in a number of experimental documentary practices today, located both inside and outside of the art world. So Haroon Farokhi is a longtime practitioner of the observational mode. He's best known, of course, for very reflexive essayistic films, but he's also been making observational documentary for about 30 years, or had been making observational documentary. So with Antje Eyman in the collaborative project Labor in a Single Shot from 2011 to 2014, he conducted filmmaking workshops around the world. So in 15 cities, people made short, single-shot films that were 1 to 2 minutes in length. And in Farokhi and Eyman's words, quote, "The subject of investigation is labor, paid and unpaid, material and immaterial, rich in tradition or altogether new," end quote. So aside from taking labor in a broad sense as their subject, these films have only one rule. As the title of the project suggests, in a single shot, there should be no cuts. So why is this important? Well, certainly it helps to forge an association with the pre-classical actualité genre, but it also seems important that without montage, there's an assertion of the preservation of the continuity of time. So at the core of labor in a single shot is not the delivery of fact-based information or even a claim to authenticity or exemplarity. The project involves making visible more than it does any effort at stabilizing or asserting meaning. If you've seen images of the world or the inscription of war, you'll remember that Farocki takes great pains in his discussion of the aerial photographs of Auschwitz to say that making something visible does not necessarily mean that it becomes knowable or even legible, but it does function as a kind of beginning. So we see here a desire to make the world available for close attention across time and distance. So this is as much about a form of image production as it is about the creation of a possibility of reception or of spectatorship. And this is where I would see the differences, one of the differences between this observational mode and, for instance, the continuous lens-based capture that we see in surveillance cameras. So labor in a single shot establishes a situation in which those actions that are most subject to the imperative of value production, most monitored, most expropriated, can be subject to a different kind of looking. So this is an ethics of attunement that does not seek to intervene or optimize or extract, but rather to witness. Just to very briefly offer a couple other examples that some of you may have seen here in the Netherlands. Kevin Jerome Everson's Tonsler Park had its world premiere at the Rotterdam Festival in January, shot on Election Day in the United States. It's an 80-minute, 16-millimeter observational work that looks at mostly African-American women who work at Everson's sort of neighborhood polling station in Tonsler Park. And on view, I believe still now, but certainly recently for the past little while at Wit de Wit in Rotterdam is Eric Baudelaire's, also known as Jihadi, which is in some sense a remake of Masao Adachi's AKA Serial Killer, but mostly consists of these long takes of static landscapes and cityscapes intercut with a series of documents from the French state. A very different, but other current example is Camera Person, a film by Kirsten Johnson, in which the filmmaker goes back over an archive of 20 years of working as a documentary cinematographer. And so we can see here, even in the title, that there's an assertion of the act of capture as absolutely primary. And in each of these three works, we can say that there's a persistence of reflexivity, but often in very unusual and inventive ways that are inscribed within the phenomenal reality or the pro-filmic scene, rather than added later. I don't really have more time to go into them in depth, but they're great films. Check them out. So, making a claim for the importance of observational documentary may seem like an unlikely or strange thing to do. It, of course, has a very, very long tradition, but not that long ago, and indeed still in some sectors, the observational mode has been wickedly, wickedly out of fashion. So the postmodernist assault on documentary naturalism occurred in the name of a progressive politics. So this was a critical project that sought to dismantle false ideological notions like presence, objectivity, authenticity, and neutrality. So the claim was that these were spurious notions that had long denied their constructedness, masquerading instead as essences. And the observational mode tends to emphasize direct engagement with the world, often with an unobtrusive camera. And so I think how we can see easily how it would become a prime target for this critique. So it was swiftly marked as naive, as not sufficiently reflexive. If we look at the many descriptions of how documentary has emerged as an object of fascination in contemporary art, we will see that the characteristics enumerated there are not those of the observational documentary. In fact, the observational documentary is sort of what documentary did before artists came along and started being reflexive. I mean, that's obviously a bogus historical argument, but it's one that's repeated pretty often. So it's been the reflexive and the performative modes that have come to dominate in recent years. And in a 1993 text, the documentary scholar Brian Winston suggested that the epistemological shift that occurred with postmodernism, quote, has created a real legitimation crisis for documentary, end quote. He said that it was perhaps best to, quote, roll with the epistemological blow, abandoning the claim to evidence, end quote. So now, 25 years later, I think we can say that this is more or less what came to pass. But I wonder if now is the time to reassert this evidential status of the image. This abandonment of evidence is, for Winston, inextricably tied to a scientific conception of film's capacity to record. So the idea of recording as inscription. And interestingly, the abandonment of this capacity has happened in a very different way during this period as well. That is to say, in the increasing dominance of computer-generated imagery. So here we have an abandonment of the facticity of pro-filmic phenomenal reality. And the rise of CGI offers, I think, a second background against which it's possible today to argue for the vitality and the necessity of the observational mode. So the images of lens-based capture, whether they're achieved through photochemical or digital means, are born out of a triangulation of three forces. We have authorial intentionality, technological mediation, and the raw materials of the world. Computer-generated images, by contrast, are synthetic images that are produced at the intersection of authorial intentionality and technological mediation alone. So there's a sense that they're freed from this encounter with alterity. We might even go so far as to say that they're solipsistic images. Able to be specified down to every last pixel, they offer a gridded control space that I would argue fulfills a fantasy of creating a totally administered world, entirely manageable, programmable, devoid of contingency. And this dream of submitting the universe entirely to a will of an authorial agency is something that, of course, runs throughout the history of live-action cinema. But there was always the sense that that desire would run up against the obstinacy of the real, which would resist being tamed completely. But when the camera cedes its place as a primary means of cinematic creation to the computer, a condition that the Belgian artist David Claerbout has called the silence of the lens, a very different form of world making comes into view. So we have no more rustling of the wind in the trees, but merely a simulated man-made wind. And this is something that Haroon Farokhi has called a new constructivism. Farokhi claimed that in each age there was a standard image. He said, quote, "You feel this very strange force that from the beginning on, computer-generated images are in competition with cinematographic and photographic images. Just like socialism wanted to defeat capitalism, they want to defeat these images, and probably they're on the verge of defeating them right now. I think computer-animated images are becoming the standard images, end quote. So for Farokhi, the standard image was a symptom. By thinking about it, we can learn something about that age, its power relations that construct its ways of being and knowing. So if we take the computer-generated image as the dominant image of our time, the question becomes, what does this increasingly hegemonic form of world-making reveal to us? What Donna Haraway called the informatics of domination involves applying computational models to all aspects of life. So there's a violent reduction of quality to quantity. And in the gridded control space of the computer-generated image, we encounter a representational form fit for such a system. It offers us a metonymical figuration of this larger formation. So CGI images offer spectacle, entertainment, sure, but they also bespeak a fantasy of governance, rationality, and mastery of a completely administered world and life at a time of crisis, uncertainty, and environmental catastrophe. So if computer-generated images can better fulfill this desire for a completely controllable world, what space does this then open within the cinema? We might say that practices that remain based in the primacy of recording take on a new urgency. And I think there's a distinction to be made that's maybe a distinction of degree rather than kind between practices that happen to use lens-based capture and practices that really insist on it as absolutely central. And I think we can say that the observational mode fits into the second category. It absolutely asserts the primacy of lens-based capture. But we might also see this in other forms of filmmaking, even something like so-called slow cinema would maybe fit this as well. So what is vanquished in the new constructivism of computer images is the unruliness of contingency that pervades observational work. So these are pictures that are made rather than pictures that are taken. And in effect, the rise of computer animation as a form of world making allows perhaps as a dialectical response for an intensified and more meaningful pursuit of one of the cinema's historical strengths, which is the registration of the world. These images by no means remain outside the domain of control, but I do think that lens-based capture possesses the ability to create a frame within which there might be time and space for the unplanned, for the unseeable, for that which resists algorithmic calculation. Today, metrics proliferate absolutely everywhere. If you work in a university, you may know this. One has the sense that if something can't be measured, it possesses no value. So the quantification of life, behavior, and affect is absolutely ubiquitous, and distressingly is often sold to us as something that will improve productivity and help us better our lives. But countering these programmable codes and the escapist fantasies of control they harbor in CGI images, one might propose that it's through engagements with cinema as an apparatus of lens-based capture and representation that we're privy to an exemplary ethical encounter with the fragility, alterity, and incalculability of our world. So just to conclude, the idea that reality has collapsed is a feeling I can absolutely relate to, but it's also one that I try and resist as much as I can, because I think we have to consider what's accomplished by repeating this sort of statement. Is there not the sense that by repeating that the present has become unreal, that in doing that we actually might be perpetuating the conditions that we attempt to describe and critique? So does the statement that reality has collapsed further the collapse of reality? Hannah Arendt wrote that the preparation for totalitarianism, quote, has succeeded when people have lost contact with their fellow men as well as with the reality around them. For together with these contacts, men lose the capacity for both experience and thought. The ideal subject for totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist. Every time we insist that we cannot believe in what we see, are we not in fact blinding ourselves to events that need witnessing? So for me, the interest of documentary lies in its ability to challenge these hegemonic formations, not to mimic them, as we might see in certain, say, post-internet practices, or conform to them. In an era in which the anthropocentric perfections of the CGI simulacrum is increasingly dominant, and in which this rhetoric of a collapse of reality serves only those who seek to further it and benefit from it, a critical space is opened for practices like the observational mode that privilege lens-based capture. And so in my view, there's nothing naive about the relationship to reality found within these films. Actually, I think they place a tremendous amount of trust in their viewer. Certainly, truth is not out there waiting to be captured by a camera, and observation is not objectivity by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think that this encounter with contingency and alterity can serve to begin a process of adjudicating what meaningfulness we might find in the world. So it's a matter of starting with close examination, attentiveness, and attunement, and proceeding from there. It's by looking hard at images constituted through an encounter with actuality that we might begin to rehabilitate the reality of experience and the standards of thought that Arendt rightly deemed so important. It's in this ethics of attunement, I think, that we can find a starting point for the production of truth. Thank you. Should I stay here?
Is it working? Yeah. Thanks for this. I will very soon open the floor to the questions, but I have one. It's relating very much to the, of course, the observational mode, but the observational documentary was, in a way, also, or as most of the books kind of teach us, was enabled by the technology. The fact that the cameras were lighter and that all of a sudden the sound recording devices were kind of also light and couldn't be moved. What we see now in this era, so after the postmodernism, we also see a lot of technology that enables us to see the reality differently. So I know that you know, of course, about the film Leviathan by Verena Pavel and Lucian Castaigne-Taylor. What happens there is like the whole GoPro kind of the whole world of cameras, which enable us to see something that we might even call the unhuman view. So I think that could we speak maybe about this new belief that now this observational mode, the new one, kind of can let us to capture something else, or is there this also a belief in that?
I mean, I think there are definitely ties to technology. I think we can trace the existence of the observational mode back to, the Lumiere or something. So I don't think it's something that just comes about with lightweight cameras and sync sound recorders in the 60s. But definitely a film like Leviathan, actually I thought about including as a slide, because that would absolutely count as an example of the kind of practice that I'm trying to sort of describe. I know some of my examples privilege the long take. I think that's one modality, but certainly not the necessary modality. And with Leviathan, these actions of like strapping cameras to bodies or throwing cameras in the ocean and using a lot of different forms of capture can absolutely do this. Whether or not, I think I wrote something once that described Leviathan as a kind of post-anthropocentric cinema, and many people have said that. And so I do think that is true, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to say that it simulates the view of an animal, which some people have said this is a fisheye view, and I would kind of pull back from that, because I do think it's a specifically technological form of vision, but as is a long take of an ocean, but yeah.
Okay, do you have any questions maybe? Anyone? I don't see well, but you can maybe hold your hand or yell. Oh, Louis, yeah.
Hello. Hey. Whoa.
Hi.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. It's not so much a question, or maybe just an observation, but just thinking about Farocki and this last film you speak about, Parallel 1 to 4, or 1 to 5, whatever it is, can't remember. And actually, maybe there's a moment where there's this perhaps a mixing of this observational and CGI, because the fantastic thing with that, I can't remember which part 1 to 5 it is, or 1 to 4, which one it is, but there's these moments where he's actually not even using CGI. It's just observing the uses of computer techniques for games. And there's these moments where like the characters are trying to fall out of space or something like that. So I wondered what perhaps that might open up. I mean, if Farocki had perhaps taken that further and continued some kind of blending of some sort of observational cinema, but like entirely CGI maybe.
It is true Parallel was made largely using like screen capture technology, so there it's not physical reality that's being captured, but kind of media experience itself. It is interesting because I do see parallel, as in many ways, along with serious games as well, as really putting forth a critique of computer animation, both its function in the world and also its kind of ontology. But the project that Furoki was making after this, which remained unfinished because he hadn't finished it at the time of his death, was a project about motion analysis, and it was specifically about trying to think the relationship between late 19th century forms of motion analysis that are proto-cinematic, so like Muybridge and Marais, and then sort of motion synthesis in kind of what he called virtual bodies, as we see in parallel. So to think kind of the 19th and the 21st centuries as these moments of like decomposing and recomposing movement. So I think there is a way in which like some of the things that you're drawing out of parallel actually might have been played out in this project that exists now only as an archive of research footage and emails. But I think some of the propositions are there.
Okay, cool.
Did that answer your question?
We have a question here.
This subject?
There was a lot of misinformation during the Brexit campaign. So a very famous thing is that there was a bus that was going around England that was widely photographed in the news media that said 350 million pounds a week for the NHS that would be given if we left the EU. This is, of course, a completely made-up number. It was like realized to be a made-up number at the time, and yet it was repeated over and over again nonetheless. The image circulated everywhere. And then as soon as the referendum happened, of course, they said, oh, well, we didn't really mean that. So that's one sort of strong example, but the general claim was that this was a campaign that was absolutely premised on the mass dissemination of lies, essentially.
So people they believe in what they see in media. Is that the point?
Some people might, but I mean, I think my point was rather that the media environment now is characterized in some sectors by a very kind of pernicious mixing of truth and fiction, right? And so if that's how we can see sort of like dominant news media as being characterized, should documentary then mirror that and also do that? Or should documentary do something else? And I'm claiming it should do something else. That maybe mixing reality and fiction, you know, once was a very powerful way of critiquing documentary claims to objectivity, but that now maybe the critical imperative has shifted. This is a super speculative claim. I mean, I maybe should have said that this is I said it was a polemic, but what I didn't say is that it's a first pass at a project that I hope will kind of get refined and more rigorous as time goes on. So there are a lot of open questions here, and I'm sort of trying to like throw some provocations out there and see, you know, see what happens.
But you're gonna.
We have just one more question now.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I saw a hand over there, so I will have to interrupt you. There is one more question there. Yeah, you.
Thanks for the wonderful lecture. It might be a bit vague, but I was wondering, as what you, I think, somehow put that through the post-structuralist, let's say, movement, we came to arrive into a criticism of this naive version of the dualistic relationship between knowledge and reality. If maybe we can think that now we are getting into a more embedded thinking of knowledge and reality together. I was wondering also, as you were acknowledging this notion of modes of observation, so it's not that the observation is a naive ultimate reality, but it's a mode that also implying, as you just said, technological aspects. If in the examples that you were showing or what you're thinking in this new trend in documentary, besides the kind of disposition to observe and to show, there is also a kind of criticism or kind of thinking about other ways of engagement. So what we have really is not really knowledge and reality, but we can see that there's always an issue of engagement that is happening, and that's not a reality as an ultimate thing, but it's that aspect that is being problematized, and I wonder if that is present in this work.
Oh, it's gone. I changed the slide as a way of starting to answer your question, but the image has, that's okay. I changed the slide to the poster for Camera Person by Kirsten Johnson. I'm not sure if that film has played here yet. It just opened in Britain recently. But that is absolutely, I think, her claim in this. It's about the person of the cinematographer and both the sort of aesthetic, but also affective investments that she has with her work and the engagement with the subjects. And she's not directing these films. These are all the footage in Camera Person was shot for films made by other filmmakers. She was working as a cinematographer. But it's absolutely about her kind of intersubjective encounters with these many people. I think in the case of Kevin Jerome Everson or Eric Baudelaire, the answer is very different. And it's not necessarily about a form of engagement. In some cases, it can be quite distanced. And Kevin Jerome Everson, though, obviously he's very embedded within the community that he's filming. In the moment of filming, he positions himself quite far away, and many people walk in front of the camera between the camera and what he is ostensibly filming, like the object of interest, which, I mean, for me, that's one of the sort of interesting inscriptions within the pro-filmic space of a kind of reflexivity about the act of observation, that it is always going to be blocked. And he allows that to happen. And at Rotterdam, maybe someone was there, but there were 2 screenings. Many, many people walked out because it's a very frustrating experience to watch something when people's backs keep getting in the way. But this, for me, was this kind of really excellent way of thinking exactly about the specific relationships that exist between subjects and a camera and a space, and also more with kind of an epistemological allegory, right? For the sense that there are always going to be these opacities that will prevent us from accessing the filmed object and its meaning or truth or what have you fully.
Thank you very much, Erika,
Thank
for
you.
this. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.